All right, welcome to our assessment module. So, assessment obviously a big thing in education and can be something we definitely need to be mindful of when thinking about ELL students. So today I just want us to kind of go over the significance and pitfalls of assessment, different types of bias. We're going to look at the exams that the Missouri Public Schools use, which is called WIDA, and we're also going to talk about ways to avoid test bias. So, all right, starting off, here's just a short video that talks about bias. It is, please check it out. I think it really does a good job of illustrating, not even ELL students, but just how race and culture can really feel the impact of test bias, and it's not necessarily a vindictive thing or something that's been done intentionally, but it's something that needs to be mindful. So another video here talking about the Aborigines and just how they learn. So please check it out. It's kind of an older video, but I think it really makes a good point of talking about how, the experiences of the Aboriginal child versus a white Australian child, and how they look at the world differently and how that affects cognition. So please check that out. All right, culture bias. Culture bias, without just reading it to you, basically it's which an assessment can limit or penalize based on gender, ethnicity, culture, language, even socioeconomics. I know that, in going back to that first YouTube video, it's the content that we see, especially in these standardized tests, sometimes can be really, really tough for our students who come from different cultures. I know I had a student who was taking a test, and they were talking about animals that live in Missouri. And she said, lion. I said, well, I don't know if lions live in Missouri. She says, oh yeah, they live at the zoo. So, how she sees, this urban kiddo, how they see animals, talking about, how their view versus, say the view of a kid who grows up in a rural area. There's going to be two very different things. Construct bias. When this talks about when the construct measured yields significant and different results for test takers from the original culture for which the test was developed and to a different culture. So, this is looking at things like an IQ test. Okay, talks a lot about American history, society. References wouldn't be fair necessarily for students who are not that aren't American. Wouldn't be growing up with those same things. I know that what was it? It was students that were missing questions based on when do you use an umbrella. In a lot of cultures, other cultures, umbrellas or parasols are used for, on sunny days to keep the sun off of you. So, students would be getting those things wrong based on, their culture versus the original culture of when you have an umbrella when it's raining. So that is construct bias. Method biased, basically is talking about, the method of the test. Testing environment can definitely play a role in that. The length of the test, sure. If you've got emerging students who are going to be reading slower, you need to make sure that the length of the time provided for the test, as well as the number of questions on the test, can kind of yield success for that student. Whether or not assistance needs to be provided. The MAP test is real picky when it comes to ELL help. Students who have been in the country for less than, I think, 13 months don't have to take the reading portion of the MAP test. Now, I think that that's kind of comical because at 14 months, is that eighth grader going to be, has that 8th grader had enough time to completely immerse themselves in a language and be assessed on it? I doubt it. But that's just kind of the way it is. So, looking at what kind of assistance you can provide, and even just standardized tests in general. A lot of these kids coming in from different cultures just don't have the experience with it. And that's not, even if they grew up going to school, standardized tests may not have been a part of that. So, just kind of looking forward at that. So some things not to do. We've talked about this before. Idioms. Our ELL students have such a hard time with idioms. So, avoiding fused forms. So like, he's going to do that, and I want to do this. Using phrasal verbs, okay, that might have multiple meanings. We can take off a pair of socks. A plane can take off the runway. Those kind of things. Put down as well. Assume that ELs understand instruction and directions. Just because there's somebody smiling and nodding doesn't mean that they are comprehending. Just making sure those instructions are clear. Don't assume it, that they understand. Don't also assume that ELLs have had experience with this type of test, bubble tests or online tests. As everything kind of just moves towards the direction of technology, it's making sure that they understand the tools and the resources, and just the nuts and bolts of how to work the program for the test is a big thing. Limiting bias. Now, there's always going to be bias. There's really no way to avoid it. But here are some things that we can try to do to limit that. Using a variety of assessments. Portfolios would be an example of that. Monitor ELL's response. Okay. Making tests culturally inclusive. This is a really easy thing to do. And, just go through your tests, and, if you got, Elizabeth and Steve, replace names with a Juan or like a Miguel or a Shukri or a Huda, using cultural names, really draw on that. It'll be more genuine to the students. Modifying the test for ELLs, obviously. We don't want to give them the answers. They still need to work towards it, but just kind of being mindful of, what is your expectation, and what is a realistic goal for them to, they have the knowledge. The problem is not their cognition. The problem is the language barrier. Providing extra time always helps. Document. Those domains. And we'll talk a little bit about WIDA when we're looking at domains. Read and write directions. Having the students looking at the directions while you read it out loud is good. Exposing students to standardized tests early out in the school year, even if it's the form of like maybe an online quiz. If you have access to the program that the test will be on, that's great. I know that map prep is a thing. Just the more time they can get to become familiar with the process, the better they'll do. Okay, so WIDA. So basically, this is the standard test that your ELL students will take. So that starts off when a student comes into the school, and they will take a home language survey. Okay, so basically I think it's 3 questions, and then that just kind of establishes what languages are spoken at home, if there's English spoken at home. Then they take the access test. So the access test is going to go through those domains, and we'll talk more about that, but it's reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Then based on their scores, it's 0 to 5, and 5 is proficient, and then they can test out of WIDA. But it's really hard for students to test out of WIDA, and I would be really surprised if most of our American-born, even American-born, strictly English-speaking students would do well on it. It can be a pretty complicated test, especially with the higher grades. An initial follow-up is usually made within 2 weeks. Really, the monitoring, it goes for about 2 years. So it's hard to get out of the ELL. It's a very comprehensive test. Depending on how you feel about it. Sometimes I think maybe it's a little too comprehensive, and I think the kids can kind of get locked into it, but that's a whole nother tirade. Home language survey. I think it's kind of interesting because we have to find out what the home language is, but to do that means we have to give the survey, and that's language. If it's not Spanish, the school is legally responsible for having these students this survey in their students' home language, but acquiring that would also need the result of the survey. So it's kind of a funny thing there. Basically, they want to know what the primary language is used in the home, and even if the student doesn't speak that language, what the language is most often spoken by the student, and what is the language that the student first acquired. So, really looking at that, what is home life like in terms of language. Okay, so WIDA measures, this is kind of the grading scale. So 6 is that reaching, that would be full proficiency, and then they're out of WIDA or out of the ELL program. So, entering would be 0 English skills. And it just kind of works its way up. All right, the 4 domains are going to be listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So when they take the access test, it will be tasks that are keyed onto these things. At the end, those scores, the 1 through 6, are combined to make an overall score. But even though it's an overall score, it's still important to look and see, where the student was excelling or struggling. So WIDA, from really grades, K through 8, it really focuses on, language acquirement. But as they start to get into the high school, it starts to take on kind of a whole nother kind of bag of worms. So, through the high school level, we start looking at social and instructional language, and then we start getting really specific of language arts, language of math, language of science, language of social studies. So, at the higher grades, the test gets very, very specific. So strategies for assessing. Based on I'm not going to read all this, but we have a couple pages of some different types of assessments. I think this is a really good thing to just keep. If you can snag these 2 slides and save them as a Word document, this kind of stuff is nice to be able to pull back on. Not to mention we'll be using it for the discussion board, but yeah, just kind of hang on to this. Look through these, highlight ones you like. But these are some different assessments and how to use them and how it's done. I also like that it kind of talks about time because that's important. When you have a class of, if you're doing a small group, that's one thing. But if you have a large class, something that like a peer review can really eat through a lot of time. It's good. You just have to make sure you have the time for it. So I hope this assessment module has enlightened you on a few things. I think it's really interesting to really think about that test bias, that construct bias, because in the cultural bias, it's really interesting, especially when you start looking at some of the assessments that you either have taken or will be taking. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Hope everybody has a great week. Don't forget to do your discussion board post, and take care.